You buy your dream home, walk across the porch with the keys still warm in your hand, and before you even step inside, someone else is already there, watching, waiting, planning. Welcome in between for episode 1. Step inside, don't worry about the eyes on the porch. They're just part of the story. I think. Before the story locks you inside, stares at you, hit the like and follow button. Turn on your notifications, just in case if something starts watching you back. This is episode 1, The Watcher House. New Jersey, a quiet, affluent suburb where the lawns are trimmed, the schools are great, and the biggest crime is usually a mailbox getting knocked over by a teenager learning to drive. It's the kind of historic town that has ranked among America's safest place. Neighbors chat over coffee at the local bakery. Children bike along tree-lined streets. Even Westfield's darkest memory, a notorious family tragically decades ago, had faded into the comforting hum of small-town life. But on one peaceful street at 657 Boulevard, something else was lying in wait. Something old, something patient, something that called itself the Watcher. And for one family, the nightmare began with a single letter. It was June 2014 when Derek and Maria Brodus thought they had found their forever home. Derek had worked his way up in the insurance industry. Maria was originally from Westfield and had always dreamt of raising their kids there. The house they bought, a 6-bedroom, 3.5-bath Dutch colonial built in 1905, was the kind of home that ends up on poster cards. Grand, stately, an American dream, rising 2.5 stories tall with oak floors, ornate fireplace, and maple trees casting shade over the manicured yard. The kind of home that had seen generations grow up within its walls. In fact, Westfield's town historian noted that one early owner, William H. Davies, even became the town's mayor while living at 657 Boulevard. A century of memories seemed etched into the woodwork. On move-in day, the Brodus children ran through the yard, picking their new bedrooms, playing on the wraparound porch, laughing. Life was good. Better than good. It was the moment every parent wishes they could freeze in time. But just 3 days after closing, that idyllic illusion shattered. Derek was at the house one evening painting, while contractors worked inside on minor renovations. He stepped out to check the mail, just a routine chore. He expected circulars, coupons, maybe a welcome note from a neighbor. Instead, he found a thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was elegant, almost old-fashioned. Curious, Derek opened it. Inside was a typed letter that began innocently enough. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. Derek smiled for a moment. How lovely, he thought, perhaps a kind of welcome from someone nearby. But as he read on, his smile evaporated. The tone shifted immediately. How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its forces within? The writer exclaimed, to be no ordinary neighbor. They introduced themselves as the Watcher, and they said they had been watching 657 Boulevard for decades. Derek's eyes skimmed the page in disbelief. According to later reports, the New York Times, this letter referenced details that weren't publicly available, things only someone very close by could have known. The Watcher described the Brodus family's minivan, the renovations in progress, even the Brodus children using their nicknames and noting their birth order. Derek's heart pounded, faster with each line. Someone had been watching his children, watching them play in the yard that very day. One line sent a chill down his spine. I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. Another line seemed to taunt the couple directly. Have you found what's in the walls yet? In time, you will. Derek blinked. In the walls? He glanced around at the darkened interior of his new home. For the first time, the gorgeous old house felt sinister. The letter continued, ranting about the house's young. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young ruled the hallways of the house. Whoever wrote this knew the Brodus family had children and seemed almost excited about it. They even asked, "Do you need to fill the house with the young?" I requested, "Better for me." It was as if the house itself demanded children. The letter writer ominously added, "Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me." Derek felt the blood drain from his face. There was more. The author bragged about their family watching the house over generations, claiming, "My grandfather watched this house in the 1920s and my father in 1960s. It is now my time." They asked if the Broduses knew the history of 657 Boulevard. "Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard?" The implication was terrifying. This wasn't just a prank, but a twisted tradition. A duty being passed down through time. The letter then issued a chilling invitation. "Welcome, my friends. Welcome. Let the party begin." It was signed in a signature that looked like cursive font, The Watcher. For a long moment, Derek stood there on the porch, the summer night settling quietly around him. Letter in hand, he felt exposed under the glow of the porch light. Watched. He lifted his gaze slowly off the page and looked into the dark yards and windows surrounding him. Somewhere out there, someone was possibly watching him read their words. He felt the blood leave his body, heart thundering. Derek dashed inside, slamming and locking the doors behind him. He turned off every light, one by one, until the house went dark. If someone was outside, he didn't want them seeing in. In the silent gloom, Derek double-checked that his children, thankfully, were not here tonight. He and Maria had decided to finish renovations before moving in. Thank God, he thought. At least the kids were safe for now, tucked away at their current home, unaware of this threat. Derek gripped the letter with shaking hands. An unnamed had targeted their family before they'd even slept a single night in the house. Someone wasn't just watching the house, they were watching them. What would you do if your dream home came with a stalker? You know what's weird? Most of the stories we tell on Haunted in Between happen in the space where your mind is tired, your guard is down, and things feel just a little off. Late nights, long edits, too much silence. And if you're anything like me, caffeine becomes part of that routine. Here's the thing though, most energy drinks make me feel worse. Jittery, foggy, like my brain's racing but not actually focused, which is ironic when you're trying to tell stories that require focus. That's why I switched to W. W wasn't made by some massive corporation. It was made by a gamer who got sick of the junk. Sugars, dyes, big blends that do nothing but crash you later. W cuts all that out and uses coffee fruit extract, which helps with the mental focus without the sharp spike and drop. It becomes part of my late night routine, recording, researching, edits, staying present when the stories get dark. If you want to try it for yourself, you can use my promo code HauntedInBetween for 10% off at checkout. Let's get the dub. The link's in the description. Now let's get back into the story. Derek contacted the police immediately that night. Westfield Police Detective Leonard Lugo responded to the scene. He arrived expecting perhaps a burglar or a trespasser. Westfield isn't a place used to truly bizarre crimes. But when Lugo read the letter, his expression turned stiff and grim. According to the police record later summarized by NJ.com, Detective Lugo advised the Broduses not to tell any neighbors about the letter. Anybody in the quiet Westfield neighborhood could be a suspect. The last thing they wanted was the watcher to be spooked into silence or cover their tracks. Officers began a canvass of the streets that very night. They kept lights off and approached houses stealthily, not wanting to tip off the mysterious writer. The Broaddus' new home, 657 Boulevard, sat on a picturesque tree-lined block where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Who among these friendly neighbors could be secretly terrorizing the family? As the police knocked on doors and whispered questions, a disturbing detail emerged from the previous owner, the Woods family. Peggy and John Wood, both retired scientists, had sold the house to the Broadduses. When contacted, the Woods revealed they had received a letter too, just one letter, about a week before they moved out in May of 2014. Their letter had also been from someone calling themselves the Watcher. However, Peggy Woods told police it was odd but not threatening. The Watcher had thanked them for taking care of the house and vaguely mentioned watching it, but it contained no insults or threats. The Woods family had dismissed it as a prank by some local eccentric and incredibly thrown the letter away. After 23 years in that house with no issue, the Woods never imagined it was anything serious, so they never mentioned it to the Broadduses before the sale. This omission later became a point of contention and even a lawsuit when the Broadduses felt the Woods should have warned them. At this early stage, the police had little to go on beyond the letter itself. Detective Lugo instructed Derek and Maria to avoid discussing the situation with other residents, so the Broadduses tried to act normal in the days following. Even as dread curled in their stomach, Maria recalled taking her kids to a barbecue at a neighbor's house, smiling politely while secretly scrutinizing everyone in sight. Could it be him? Or her? Who among our new friends might be the Watcher? Every friendly smile now felt like a potential mask for malice. Meanwhile, one neighbor on the block immediately stood out. A man who reportedly sat in a lawn chair facing 657 Boulevard for hours at a time, just watching, according to investigative articles from The Cut and the Star-Ledger. This individual would literally position himself in his yard, chair angled towards the Broaddus home, as if it were his personal entertainment. Another nearby neighbor was seen more than once peering at the Broaddus house through binoculars while contractors worked. Both behaviors were odd and unsettling, but they weren't crimes. When questioned by police, these neighbors gave benign explanations. One said he just enjoyed the view. Another claimed to be birdwatching. Still, the Broadduses couldn't shake the feeling that someone close by had to be lurking behind those letters. Investigators also considered the possibility of a prank by local teenagers. Westfield had its share of restless high schoolers on summer break, but the letter's tone felt too sophisticated, too literary, as one detective put it. To be teens' work, the level of detail, knowing the children's nickname and the contractor's schedule, suggested an adult who was often around. And then came letter number 2. This second letter arrived only a couple of weeks after the first, while the investigation was quietly underway. The Broadduses hadn't even finished grappling with the first letter when the Watcher struck again. If the first note had been unnerving, the second was far more personal. Blood run cold. I am pleased to know your names now, and the names of the young you have brought me. Young. The Watcher was fixated on the Broaddus children in a way that made every parent's skin crawl. This creepy phrase became the chilling centerpiece of the entire investigation. The letter went on to say, I have seen your children. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted, and even asked if there were more on the way. The writer clearly had observed them closely, and recently. Worse, the Watcher described seeing the kids playing in the backyard and even knowing which child was in which room. Here's the thing. Only a handful of houses could see the Broadduses' small backyard due to fences and trees. Detectives literally mapped out sight lines, standing in the windows or yards of various neighbors' homes to test what could be seen from each angle. They marked up a map of 657 Boulevard with cones of vision and even plotted an earshot range for who might hear Maria when she called the kids' names in the backyard. The results narrowed the suspect pool. The letter had information that only a few close neighbors could know. The second letter also referenced specifics of the Broaddus' life that hadn't been public. It mentioned the sound of the contractors, hammers, and drills echoing inside the house. It mentioned the family's plans to remodel 657 Boulevard before moving in. It even speculated about where each child would sleep, identifying the bedrooms by location. This wasn't random, and it definitely wasn't a casual prank. This was someone who either lived extremely close by or had direct access to the house at some point. At this stage, Westfield police brought in some extra help. They ran DNA tests on the envelopes and stamps of the letters, hoping for a match in any database. In a surprising twist, forensic analysts determined that at least one envelope had been licked by a woman. That detail, later reported by the New York Times, shifted the focus a bit. Perhaps the watcher wasn't an angry man, as Derek had automatically assumed, but possibly a woman, or someone using a woman to mail the letters. Detectives quickly asked female neighbors for voluntary DNA samples, or checked anything they might discard. At one point, law enforcement even serendipitously collected a water bottle used by a neighboring woman who was a suspect to compare her DNA, but it didn't match the watcher's profile. Whoever the DNA belonged to, it did not hit any known profiles in criminal databases either. Another dead end. Still, the evidence of a female DNA profile raised new questions. Could the watcher actually be a woman, or was it a man working with a woman, a spouse, a family member, to send the letters? The mystery deepened. Then came letter number 3. This one arrived later in 2014 as the Broadduses continued to delay moving in the house. By now, local police had quietly enlisted some federal agents for advice, including former FBI agents, and the Broadduses themselves were pursuing every lead they could. More on that soon. The watcher was growing angrier with each letter, perhaps frustrated with the family had not moved in or acknowledged them. In the third letter, the writer's tone was enraged, accusing the Broadduses of ignoring earlier warnings. You have changed the house and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The watcher seemed offended that the Broadduses' renovations were altering their beloved house. They spoke as if that 657 Boulevard had a soul that was being wounded. It cries for the past, the letter said. When I roamed its halls, this hinted at an almost supernatural sense of attachment, as if the watcher's identity was intertwined with the house's history. Indeed, the letter claimed that the writer's family had watched the home for generations since the 1920s. A grandfather, a father, and now them, all fulfilling some duty to observe 657 Boulevard as it approached its 110th birthday. It sounded like a deranged tradition, passed down like a family heirloom. The watcher even asked, "Do you know the history of the house?" taunting that they might know secrets the Broadduses did not. Naturally, investigators and the Broadduses took this letter to a local historian for fact-checking. If someone really had been watching the house for so long, surely there'd be whispers or records. Local historians dug into Westfield's archives and old newspapers looking for any hint of a watcher figure or odd happenings at 657 Boulevard. They found no evidence that any one family had known traditions of surveilling the home. No mentions of a grandparent in 1920s or a father in 60s doing such a thing. The watcher's claim of multi-generational stalking lineage appeared to be either a lie or a big delusion. However, while combing through the house's histories, researchers did uncover some disturbing stories tied to 657 Boulevard. In the early 1900s, not long after the house was built, a maid employed by the home's then owner allegedly died under mysterious circumstances on the property. The old tale claims she fell from an upstairs window or down a staircase. The details are fuzzy in the archived reports, but the gossip at the time wondered if something pushed her. Was it an accident or something more sinister? No one could say for sure. A previous homeowner in the 1960s was rumored to have suffered serious paranoid episodes. Neighbors recalled that this former owner would sometimes pace in front of 657 Boulevard at night, muttering about the house watching him. He eventually moved away to get help, and his family put the antidotes down to mental illness. But hearing it now, with the hindsight of these letters, one has to wonder, did that man genuinely feel watched by an unseen presence here, or even receive letters of his own? There's no record he did, but the coincidence of language is eerie. Over the decades, a few families who lived at 657 Boulevard experienced unusual misfortunes. A series of illnesses and sudden deaths occurred among early occupants of the home. For instance, records show that Mayor William H. Davies' wife, Florence, died in the house in 1943, and Davies himself died there in 1947. Of course, they were elderly, perhaps nothing strange, but another owner in the 1950s supposedly lost a child to illness unexpectedly while living at 657. And there were whispers that the house just had bad luck. None of these events were definitely connected to one another. People die, accidents happen, and Westfield's older homes all have their share of history. But taken together, the history of the home was unquestionably strange. It's as if 657 Boulevard had seen more than its share of sorrow, quietly cataloged in the Westfield Historical Society archives. All this sent the Broaddus's imaginations reeling. Could it be that the watcher was some long-grieving descendant of a past owner, angry about what the house had become? Or an eccentric local historian who felt protective of the place and its true character? The letters certainly radiated an obsession with the past, with things staying as they used to be. Then came something investigators didn't expect. Paranormal investigators offered to examine the house as the case gained quiet traction in town. A few self-proclaimed ghost hunters and mediums reached out, suggesting that maybe it wasn't just a person at all. Maybe 657 Boulevard really did harbor some dark spirit. It sounds far-fetched, but the Broadduses were desperate for answers. Though Derek was skeptical, Maria was open to anything that might explain the dread settling over her dream home. Several paranormal teams came one after the other, conducting overnight stays and spirit box sessions in the empty house. They scoured the basements with EMF detectors, climbed into the attic with thermal cameras, and walked the hallways with dowsing rods. Incredibly, or perhaps predictably, multiple teams, independent of each other, reported the same things. A pressure in the air, especially on the second floor landings. A heaviness that seemed to ebb and flow without explanation. And most interesting, a persistent sensation of being watched from one particular area, the upstairs hallway, near the oldest of the bedrooms at the front of the house. One psychic claimed she felt a presence by an old dumbwaiter shaft, as if something or someone was peering out. Another investigator's motion-activated camera in an empty hallway caught, he swore, the faint sound of a voice on the audio of whispers that, when strained to hear, sounded like it could be saying, "Watching." Of course, whether psychological suggestions or something supernatural is impossible to say. But here's the thing. The Broaddus family reported the same feeling even before the ghost hunters came through. Derek and Maria had both, on separate occasions, told each other that they felt a weird vibe on the second floor, as if they weren't alone there. Maria would later admit that when she went back to 657 Boulevard to pick up the mail or meet contractors, she'd sometimes catch herself looking over her shoulder, certain she'd see someone standing in the shadows of the upstairs hallway, but no one was ever there. It just felt heavy, she said, of the house's atmosphere. Was it the power of suggestion from the letters? Very possibly, but it was real enough that the Broadduses decided not to bring their kids into the house at all until it was resolved. By now, summer was turning to fall of 2014. Months had passed, and the beautiful house at 657 Boulevard stood mostly empty. Renovations largely finished, but the family who owned it was too afraid to move in. Imagine paying over $1.3 million for your dream home and then being terrified to live there. The Broadduses were effectively paying mortgage and property taxes on a haunted, or at least stalked, house. While living with Maria's parents elsewhere in Westfield, their dream was turning into financial and emotional nightmare. You'd think selling the house would end the nightmare. It didn't. By early 2015, the case of the Watcher had stalled. Despite multiple letters, dozens of interviews, and extensive surveillance, the Westfield police had made no arrest. Frustration was mounting for everyone involved. Investigators eventually suspected everyone. No one in the neighborhood was above scrutiny now. They looked at the immediate neighbors, any who seemed overly interested or who had direct line of sight to the house. They looked at local teenagers, known pranksters, or troubled kids with computers, thinking perhaps someone was cyberstalking the family for kicks. They even looked reluctantly at members of the Broaddus family themselves. Yes, the police had to consider, could Derek or Maria or someone close to them be writing these letters as some kind of hoax? It's not unheard of for a new homeowner to get cold feet or for disputes to arise and strange hoaxes to be staged. By mid-2015, rumors in Westfield's gossip circle and even among some officers suggested a dark possibility. Could the Broadduses have mailed the letters themselves? This theory gained traction among certain neighbors. Perhaps they whispered Derek and Maria had buyer's remorse and wanted to find a way to undo the sale. Or maybe they hoped to launch a sensational lawsuit for a big payout. They had sued the previous owners after all. Others speculated the couple was in over their heads financially and needed an excuse to walk away from the hefty mortgage, a kind of elaborate scheme to get the town to buy the house back or allow teardown for profit. It sounds far-fetched, but when the case went public, more on that later. Plenty of armchair detectives online also latched onto the self-hoax theory. After all, who else had the most to gain from scaring the family out of the house than the family themselves? Derek Broaddus was by all accounts a successful guy, but not a millionaire. Maybe he'd stretched to buy that $1.3 million home and then regretted it. Westfield police did quietly investigate this possibility. They interviewed the Broadduses multiple times more, looking for inconsistencies. They had handwriting experts compare the envelope and note to samples of Derek's and Maria's writing. No match. They already knew the DNA on the letter didn't match Maria, and presumably not the children. And while Derek's DNA was never publicly compared, the fact that the DNA appeared female-made, it's less likely to be him. The content of the letter contained references that would have required an almost inhumane level of cruelty or acting if Derek or Maria had written them. Threatening their own kids, describing wanting to lure them. By all accounts, the Broadduses were genuinely terrified and even traumatized by the letters. Derek later said he was a depressed wreck during this period. Investigators found no evidence that Derek or Maria were staging this. No strange purchases, no digital footprints of writing drafts, nothing. So the self-hoax theory never held weight. In the end, authorities and a hired forensic linguist concluded that it was highly unlikely the family faked such elaborate letters without slipping up somewhere. And the emotional toll on them was very real, not something they seemed to be faking. With that suspicion largely debunked, the Broadduses were back to being victims of an unknown, and that meant the Watcher was still out there. Meanwhile, one favorite suspect of the original investigators kept coming up, the Langford family, who lived right next door. The Langfords had lived in their house since the 1960s, literally one door down from 657 Boulevard. The family patriarch, Richard Langford, had died years earlier, and the adult children, now in their 60s, still lived in the house with their 90-something-year-old matriarch, Peggy. To Westfield locals, the Langfords were a bit eccentric, maybe a little off, but mostly known as a harmless, long-rooted family. However, one of the Langford's son, Michael Langford, drew particular attention. Michael was in his early 60s, unemployed, and described by neighbors as a Boo Radley type of reclusive figure who occasionally did odd things like walk through people's backyards or peek into windows out of curiosity. It was well known that Michael had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. He sometimes spooked newcomers, but those who knew him insisted he was benign. Still, consider the facts from the investigators' perspective. The Langford house was right next door, on the side of which much of the Broaddus property and porch were visible. In fact, the Broadduses recalled that when they first toured 657 Boulevard, one of the older Langford children, a woman, had even commented on how excited they must be in a way that struck them as odd later. The letters from the watcher mentioned the house is crying from the past when I ran through its halls. The Langfords had been there since the 60s, aligning with the timeline the watcher gave for their father watching in the 60s. Richard Langford, the father, died 12 years prior, which might match the watcher's comment that it was the Woods' time to move on and kindly sold it when I asked, perhaps implying the previous owners left at the watcher's prompting. It was all circumstantial, but the coincidences piled up. Derek Broaddus himself thought the case was solved when he learned the family next door had been there for so long. Detective Lugo had brought Michael Langford in for an interview early on, about a week after the first letter arrived. During that interview, Michael denied knowing anything about letters or any stalking, according to what the Broadduses later told The Cut. Lugo said that Michael's demeanor was odd, but his story matched certain things in the way that kept him a viable suspect. Perhaps Michael spoke about loving the neighborhood's history or commented on details that also appeared in the letters. The police never revealed specifics. But again, there was no direct evidence. In a further attempt to smoke out the watcher, the Broaddus family worked with police on clever ruse. They publicly announced plans to tear down 657 Boulevard, effectively threatening to destroy the beloved house, to see if that would provoke the watcher into writing again, or even revealing themselves. This plan was risky. Derek and Maria didn't actually want to demolish their dream home, but they were willing to try anything. They sent a letter to the Langfords specifically, informing them and other neighbors that due to ongoing issues, they might have to demolish the house and sell the lot. If any neighbor was the watcher, presumably such news would enrage them. After all, the watcher's letters showed a possessive love for the house's architecture and history. But when this news circulated, nothing happened. No furious letters from the watcher protesting from the demolition came. If the Langfords were the culprits, they didn't take the bait. The Broadduses even hired a high-profile former FBI agent named Robert Lenehan to conduct a threat assessment on the letters. Lenehan pored over every line of the letter for clues. He noted several old-fashioned quirks in the writing. For example, the envelopes were addressed to M/M Broaddus, an old-style address form for Mr. and Mrs. The letters often included the day's weather in the situation, warm and humid or sunny and cool for a summer day, and the sentences were double-spaced. These all pointed to an older author, perhaps someone with a more formal or old way of writing. The vocabulary and tone had a certain literary flair. Words like young and phrases like, I am pleased to know your names, aren't common everyday speech, suggesting the writer might be a reader or someone with theatrical bent. Intriguingly, Lenehan also remarked on the lack of profanity or truly obscene language. Despite the threatening tone, the watcher never really cursed at the family, aside from calling them perhaps greedy. This suggests a person with some degree of self-control or propriety, again hinting at an older or educated individual. Lenehan's psychological profile deduced that while the letters were deeply unsettling, the author likely might not act on the threats. In his experience, the type of person who writes such elaborate anonymous letters enjoys the power of scaring, but isn't always the same as someone who commits physical violence. However, he cautioned the erratic nature of the letters, the typos, the mix of eloquency and mistakes implied a certain instability of eccentricity. An erratic individual can be unpredictable. So while the Watcher's letters had a veneer of old-time civility, there was no guarantee the person behind them was harmless. Another consultant, a former FBI agent who had been part of the behavioral analyst unit, compared the case to others and noted that the Watcher displayed a high degree of planning and obsession. This wasn't an impulsive teenager or casual prankster. It seemed more like an entrenched grievance or fixation. Was it a displaced neighbor angry about not getting the house? A local crank with too much time on their hands? Or someone who truly believed 657 Boulevard was theirs in some spiritual or familial way? The Broadduses even hired a forensic linguist to score online forums and social media for any writing that resembled the Watcher's particular style. Perhaps the Watcher ranted elsewhere on the internet under a pseudonym that experts didn't find any definitive matches in the local online community, though he did offer one quirky observation. The author might be a fan of Game of Thrones. In one letter, the Watcher had written about calling the children and drawing them to me. The linguist noted a possible parallel to a term from the Game of Thrones. The Watcher on the Wall, member of the Night's Watch, and the show are often called Watchers on the Wall. This was extremely tenuous, of course, but it showed how every angle, even pop culture references, were being considered. If the Watcher were a Game of Thrones fan, that didn't narrow things much. Millions of people were. While all this private investigating was going on, the focus remained on the Langfords for lack of a better suspect. The Westfield Police, in cooperation with the Union County Prosecutor's Office, conducted a second, more in-depth interview with Michael Langford, essentially interrogating him, but it led nowhere. Michael maintained his innocence calmly. His sister Abby Langford, who actually worked as a real estate agent, was also scrutinized. Some wondered if she might have been upset at missing the commission on the sale of 657 Boulevard, though the Broaddus purchase wasn't publicly listed, so who knows. In a clever move, a detective arranged to get a discarded bottle from Abby to test her DNA, as mentioned earlier. It didn't match the DNA on the letters, eliminating her. The Langford family understandably began to feel harassed by the suspicion. At one point, the Broadduses and their investigator even met with the Langford's attorney to show them the evidence and letters, hoping to provoke a reaction. The meeting grew tense, with the Langfords angrily denying any involvement. Peggy Langford, the elderly mother, was said to be both confused and upset that her family was the target of ridiculous accusations. One of her sons, Sandy Langford, later said to the press, "We got accused of doing something we didn't do. Did we ever get an apology? Never." The Langfords, for their part, felt the Broadduses were unfairly pointing fingers to solve their own problem. "This guy gets all these letters, and all of a sudden people are pointing fingers," Sandy Langford said in frustration. By the end of 2015, with no evidence definitely linking the Langfords or anyone else to the letters, the investigation hit a wall. Westfield police had expended hundreds of man-hours. The Broadduses' private efforts, stakeouts, lab tests, expert analysts had all turned up tantalizing clues, but nothing actionable. The Watcher, whoever it was, had managed to strike 3 times without leaving enough of a trail to be caught. The Broaddus family's life had been turned upside down. They never moved into 657 Boulevard, not for one single night. The risk felt too great. Who would willingly put their children in harm's way, Maria thought. Was someone targeting them? By late 2014, Derek and Maria had put the house back on the market, only months after buying it. But word had quietly spread among realtors that something was off about the house. Westfield is a tight-knit community, and though the Broadduses tried to keep the letters secret at police instructions, rumors leaked. One broker emailed to another prospective buyer's agent said her clients loved the house, but there was, quote, something about it were passing. The stigma had taken hold even before the full story went public. No one would buy it, not anywhere near the asking price at least. The Broadduses felt trapped. They owned a beautiful $1.3 million house they were afraid to live in and couldn't easily sell. They were paying a mortgage for a property that was effectively uninhabitable to them. In 2016, out of desperation, they even applied to the local planning board for permission to tear down 657 Boulevard and subdivide the lot into 2 smaller parcels to sell. Perhaps the 2 new houses on that prime street could recoup their losses, but this plan was met with fierce opposition from neighbors and was ultimately denied by the town in early 2017. Many neighbors didn't want the character of the street ruined, even if it meant keeping the Watcher house intact. One could imagine the Watcher, whoever it was, grinning at the outcome. Their precious house would not be torn down after all. Running low on options, the Broadduses decided to rent out 657 Boulevard in 2017. If they couldn't sell it yet, maybe someone would lease it, allowing the family to offset some costs while they moved elsewhere. Eventually, a family agreed to rent the house on the condition that Derek and Maria disclose the Watcher letters. By now, the story had hit local news, so the new tenants were aware. Derek and Maria did disclose everything, and remarkably, this brave family moved in anyway, perhaps thinking the whole thing was overblown. For a while, it was quiet. Maybe the Watcher had finally given up now that the Broadduses themselves were gone. Months went by peacefully, but then another letter arrived, addressed to 657 Boulevard in February 2017. The tenants opened it in shock and immediately called Derek. This 4th letter was different in tone. It was almost gleeful, but laced with a new kind of venom. The Watcher seemed to have been monitoring the media coverage and the Broadduses' struggle, and now wrote of some revenge. According to Derek, this 2017 letter was filled with bizarre threats, not direct threats to a specific person, but lists of possible horrors that could befall the occupants of 657 Boulevard. The Watcher wrote things like, maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick day after day after day. It was as if they were cursing the house, imagining all the ways fate could punish the family. The letter also referenced the recent attempt to sell and the media frenzy mocking the Broadduses' efforts. One line that Derek revealed publicly later said, "You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won." Another ominous line warned the new renter that the house wants young and taunted that if they didn't have children, the Watcher might send them a truly unsettling, incomprehensible threat. Understandably, the renters were spooked. They hadn't signed up for active harassment. However, when no immediate harm followed, they agreed to stay, but only until they found a new place a few months later. The Broadduses had to provide a security guard for a short time to assure the renters' fears. By 2019, 5 years after the first letter, Rick and Maria Broaddus finally managed to find a buyer and sold 657 at a significant loss. The house, which they purchased for $1.355 million, sold around $959,000, over $400,000 less than what they paid. It was a bitter end to their home ownership saga, but they felt relief to be rid of it. Buyer was a young family, ironically with children of their own, who insisted to stay anonymous. They did not want to be part of the media circus that had developed around Watcher House. Most families, after finally escaping such a nightmare, would have moved on and tried to forget it all. And the Broadduses did try to move forward. They stayed in Westfield. It was Maria's hometown after all, buying a smaller house elsewhere in town. They were determined not to be driven away from the community entirely, but the Watcher apparently did not move on. According to one report, another letter surfaced after the sale in 2019, delivered either to the house or someone passed along to the Broaduses that took a triumphant mocking tone in this perpetuated final missive. The Watcher gloated that they had outlasted the Broadus family, who had fled, and congratulated the house on being safe from the Broaduses' changes. "You lost." It essentially told Derek and Maria the Watcher won. It was signed, as always, the Watcher. It's worth noting that subsequent reporting in the late 2019 and beyond suggested that the new owners never received any Watcher letters directly. If that's true, perhaps the Watcher decided their victory lap letter was the end of it, or perhaps that final taunt was an unconfirmed rumor. To this day, those new owners have maintained they have not been bothered. Perhaps the Watcher finally went dormant, or perhaps, as Derek suspects, the Watcher still lives quietly in the neighborhood, content that the Broaduses family is gone. And so, after 6 letters, 3 to the Broaduses, 1 to the Woods, 1 to renters, and possibly 1 post-sale, endless investigations and untold psychological torment, here is the end result. No suspect has ever been identified. No charges have ever been filed. And the letters seemingly have stopped. But the Watcher has never been caught. What do you make of mystery with no answer? For the Broadus family, it was a real-life nightmare that uprooted their lives. For the town of Westfield, it became an infamous saga that for time shattered the town's image of suburban tranquility. Because once the lawsuit they filed in 2015 became public, media had a field day. A local reporter sniffed at the story from court filings, and soon Star Ledger, NJ.com, and other Jersey outlets splashed headlines about the Watcher House. By 2018, the New York Times had run a front-page story on it, and New York Magazine's The Cut published a massively detailed feature that went viral. Suddenly, Westfield was swarming with news vans and curiosity seekers. Neighbors who once quietly pondered the mystery now had to endure their blocks becoming famous for something out of a horror movie. It was as if this quiet town woke up to find itself the star of the latest true crime sensation, a role it never wanted. Theories spread like wildfire in newspapers, on TV, and essentially online. Everyone had a guess about the Watcher's identity and motives. Some thought it was indeed a jealous house hunter, someone who had lost out on the bidding war for 657 Boulevard and wanted revenge by scaring the new owners away. It's true, the Broaduses paid above the asking price. Could a thwarted buyer have snapped and become the Watcher? One letter did sneer about greed, bringing the family to the house, which might hint at resentment. Others floated that it could have been disgruntled realtor who hadn't gotten the commission, or perhaps a local eccentric who just loves messing with people. One theory ventured into urban legend territory. What if someone had been secretly living inside the house, in the walls, or a hidden room, like someone kind of twisted real-life parasite? This notion of a squatter living in the walls for years, while creepy and cinematic, was also least plausible. No evidence of that was ever found. But the fact that the Watcher's letters asked, "Have you found what's in the walls yet?" gave fuel to that chilling idea. It evoked classic horror tales of houses with secret occupants, like The Boy or People Under the Stairs. And of course, many continued to suspect Michael Langford, or one of his siblings. After all, how else could the Watcher hear Maria calling the kids by name unless they were very nearby? One neighbor told The Cut that based on hearing distance, it seemed likely the Watcher was an elderly neighbor, right adjacent. The Langfords fit that bill. However, by 2020, Michael Langford passed away, never having been charged and denying involvement to the end. If he was the Watcher, the letters likely would have stopped after his death, but they arguably stopped before that. So perhaps it wasn't him after all, or he didn't act alone. Another strange suspect did emerge. Investigators found that one of the Broadus' neighbors had a grown son who was into some dark video games where he used the screen name The Watcher. That young man's girlfriend even told police he was into really scary stuff. At one point, this boyfriend agreed to come in for an interview, but twice failed to show up. Some internet sleuths wonder if he could have been involved, but nothing concrete ever tied him to the letters beyond the spooky username. And then, of course, the skeptics remained, those who believed Derek and Maria orchestrated everything. Conversation on the mystery was frequently unflattering to the Broadduses once the story went wide. As we discussed, neighbors voiced suspicions of a hoax or scam. Online forums had people picking apart the family's finances and personality. The Broadduses were essentially victim blamed by some accused of creating their own boogeyman to cover financial mistakes. This caused the family a lot of pain. Derek Broaddus, normally a reserved corporate guy, sometimes fired back on social media at people spreading false rumors. He insisted that none of this was a hoax, that his family had been targeted by an unknown and undisturbed person, and that was the truth. As he tweeted in 2012, "Mental illness is real, and so is the person who was so angry that we bought 657. They thought it'd be a good idea to threaten a 5-year-old. Derek firmly believes the Watcher is real, and was likely a neighbor, close enough to see and hear what went on, and he continued to hope it's a solvable crime." One interesting parallel that media pointed out, Westfield had another infamous resident before, John List, who in 1971 brutally murdered his wife, mother, and 3 children in their Westfield home, and then disappeared for 18 years. The List murders were a horrific chapter in Westfield's history, a shock that shattered the town's sense of security back then with the arrival of the Watcher's case decades later. Some noted the Westfield now had 2 boogeymen in its lore. John List, who had been flesh and blood evil, and the Watcher, an unseen menace. In fact, when the Broadduses' story hit the news, some Westfield old-timers recalled John List as a reminder that bad things can happen even here. It's a chilling coincidence that List's crime happened in another grand Westfield home just few blocks away. And in an odd Hollywood twist, 2022 television dramatization of The Watcher even wove John List's character into its plot, merging the 2 local legends. Yes, by the way, this mystery entered pop culture in a big way. In October 2022, Netflix released The Watcher, a limited series created by Ryan Murphy of American Horror Stories fame. The show took significant creative liberties, inventing new characters and supernatural subplots, but it brought a surge of renewed attention to the real case. In the series, the family's surname was changed and some details altered at the Broadduses' request. For instance, the TV family has 2 older children instead of 3 young ones to protect the Broadduses' kids. Nonetheless, the TV portrayal captured the central terror of the situation, the claustrophobic fear of being watched by an anonymous, possibly omnipresent figure. The Netflix show dramatized and embellished the story, introducing, for example, a fictional secret tunnel under the house and an eccentric private investigator, none of which were part of the real story. It even added a ghostly aspect with a character based loosely on John List. But at its core, it kept the letter, often quoting them verbatim, and the fact that the mystery was never solved. The release of the show prompted a wave of tourism and morbid curiosity in Westfield. People drove by 657 Boulevard, snapping photos, to the dismay of the current occupants. The town had to deal with its local boogeyman, becoming internationally famous. The Westfield Historical Society had folks asking about the house archives. The mayor fielded questions from reporters worldwide. It was, as one resident put it, beyond uncanny, and even made the front page of the New York Times again. Now in the arts and TV section, as a life imitated art and vice versa. For the Broaddus family, watching their nightmare turn into entertainment was mixed experience. They have said they're happy the show didn't use their names and they've generally stayed out of the limelight. They participated only minimally in its production. One might imagine it's somewhat cathartic to see a version of events play out on screen, maybe hoping the fictional story gives some sense of closure that reality didn't. But in truth, the real Watcher case remains a giant question mark. In the end, the Watcher's identity and motive remain a mystery. Was it really about the house? An antiquarian avenger upset about renovations and hungry for young to return life to an old home? Was it personal, a vendetta against the Broaduses, significantly born of envy or resentment? Or was it the work of an unstable mind, projecting fantasies onto an innocent family and an address that for whatever reason became an obsession? We simply don't know. What we do know is that the letters stopped when the Broadus family left. Perhaps the Watcher won in their eyes. Perhaps without the thrill of tormenting Derek and Maria, it wasn't fun anymore. Or perhaps the Watcher is still watching 657 Boulevard, quietly waiting for a new chapter to begin with another unsuspecting family in the future. 5 years have passed since the sale, and thankfully there have been no new reports of letters. Or maybe, just maybe, somewhere in Westfield, someone still keeps one eye always on the house, their house, and the other eye on the mailbox, ready to strike again if the mood compels. No one knows for sure, so I'll leave you with this thought. If you bought your dream home, the big beautiful house on the hill, or that idyllic colonial on the quiet street, and then the letters start coming, letters that knew your children's name, letters that warned of secrets in your walls, letters that promised the writer was always watching, would you stay? Would you brush it off as a prank and move in anyway, bolstering your courage with security cameras and hope? Or would you do what the Broadus family ultimately did? Leave everything behind to protect your family, eating the financial loss, but maybe saving your sanity, always wondering who won in the end. Let us know your thoughts in the comments or on social media. What would you have done in their shoes? And don't forget to follow The Haunted In Between for more true stories that blur the lines between reality and nightmare. This story of the Watcher may be over for now, but its legend will no doubt live on in Westfield lore for decades. And who knows, maybe one day the truth will come out. Next week, we take you into the frozen wilderness of Russia, where 9 hikers met a fate so terrifying, so unexplained, it still defies science and logic. The infamous Dyatlov Pass incident. As always, we are the Haunted In Between. Remember, you're not alone, you're in between.